Ladies and gentlemen, let's do some Immanuel Kant. Preface to the second edition, 1787. Whether the treatment... Now, okay, what he wants to say at this first sentence is that we're going to be able to understand this particular thing. Okay? We will be able to understand whether the treatment of that portion of our knowledge which lies within the province of pure reason... Now let's just call it pure knowledge, okay? We will be able to tell whether the treatment of pure knowledge advances with the undeviating certainty which characterizes science. So he thinks that science advances with undeviating certainty. Or that's how he characterizes the progress of science, is advancing with undeviating certainty. Now, while he was alive, there were steam engines. They didn't move yet. They were like several stories tall, but they were there. So science was moving forward. They had electricity. They would shock people in little parlor games and stuff. They had no use for it. It was just a trick game. So he viewed science as pretty amazing, and he says here it advances with undeviating certainty. But he says we will be able to tell whether our knowledge which lies within the province of pure reason also advances in that way. If we find those who are engaged in metaphysical pursuits unable to come to an understanding as to the method which they ought to follow, so we find somebody who's dealing in this realm of pure ideas, if we find them confused, if we find them after the most elaborate preparations, invariably brought to a stand before the goal is reached and compelled to retrace their steps and strike into fresh paths, we may then feel sure that they are far from having attained to the certainty of scientific progress. So if people keep making mistakes and then having to go back, they may rather be said to be merely groping about in the dark. Now, who exactly he's got in mind, I don't know. Probably like David Hume or something like this. You know, some philosophers who keep trying but have ended up not making it or something. So, in these circumstances, we shall render an important service to reason if we succeed in simply indicating the path along which it must travel. Now, if you can't think for yourself and you read this, that sentence right there might stand out to you. You might even underline it in red, and when your teacher says, "What do we think about Immanuel Kant?" you'll raise your hand and you'll say, "Well, he wants to render an important service to reason by indicating the correct path along which it must travel," right? In order to arrive at any results. Well, good then. He's trying to save reason, isn't he? Right? In order for it to arrive at any results at all, he's going to have to indicate the path along which it must travel. Even if it should be found necessary to abandon many of those aims which, without reflection, have been proposed for its attainment. In other words, there are some things that some people thought we were going to do with reason. However, those are wrecked now, but now at least we will be on the correct path. What he has in mind there, I don't know. But he doesn't even know what he had in mind. As Ayn Rand said, he wasn't able to develop the full implications of his philosophy surrounded by the Enlightenment. That logic has advanced in this sure course, even from the earliest times. The fact that logic has advanced in this sure course, even from the earliest times, is apparent from the fact that, since Aristotle, it has been unable to advance a step, and thus, to all appearances, has reached its completion. So, now they have done some things with modern formal logic, and I've done some videos on it, 2 or 3 hours of videos on it. So if you're interested in modern formal logic that MrCropper would approve of, because not everything out there is approved by MrCropper, you can take a look at my logic series and get the book therein. Okay, so he's quite confident that Aristotle did a pretty good job in creating logic. And he's going to use it. He's going to take it as a given. He doesn't care where Aristotle got it and how. He's just going to take it and use it in the realm beyond sense perception. Because he thinks it must be a powerful system if it gives us everything in human cognition and philosophy that we have and know. It's got to be a powerful system. Therefore, let's divorce it from reality. Let's just start figuring out things within our own mind and inside of our own head with logic. Okay, so that's Kant. Here we go. For if some of the moderns have thought to enlarge its domain by introducing psychological discussions on the mental faculties, such as imagination and wit, metaphysical discussions on the origin of knowledge and the different kinds of certitude, according to the difference of objects, idealism, skepticism, and so on, or anthropological discussions on prejudices, their causes and remedies, this attempt on the part of these authors only shows their ignorance of the peculiar nature of logical science. Right, so he's smearing somebody somehow for something there, isn't he? That's a doozy of a sentence. 5 lines. If some of the moderns have thought to enlarge its domain, the domain of logic, by introducing psychological discussions on the mental faculties, such as imagination and wit, metaphysical, discussions on the origins of knowledge and the different kinds of certitude, according to the difference of objects like idealism and skepticism and so on, or anthropological discussions on prejudice, their causes and the remedies. Okay. If some moderns have thought to enlarge the domain of logic by introducing this list of things, this attempt on the part of these authors only shows their ignorance of the peculiar nature of logical science. Well, if you take out all the stuff he did in there, which was quite a doozy, then that's all he really says. If some moderns have tried to enlarge logic, it only shows their ignorance of the peculiar nature of logic. So it's just a smear. That's a really big sentence to just be a smear if you really look at it. He really, really counts on people not stopping and focusing and understanding what he says. That is his whole thing. Continuing, we do not enlarge, but disfigure the sciences when we lose sight of their respective limits. So don't lose sight of the limits of science, because we don't enlarge it, we disfigure it. Okay? And we allow them to run into one another. Oh, so keep the sciences separate now. That's interesting. So don't allow the sciences to run into one another, or else they become disfigured. They don't become enlarged. Now, logic is enclosed within limits which admit of perfectly clear definitions. Now, Immanuel Kant, how would we know that those are clear definitions, unless we checked with reality? It is a science which has for its object nothing but the exposition of proof of the formal laws of all thought. Yeah, but what would they prove? They would prove something. Whether it be a priori or empirical. Wrong, there's no a priori thought. Whatever be its origin or its object, and whatever the difficulties natural or accidental, which it encounters in the human mind. La-di-da-di-da. So, logic is enclosed within limits which admit of perfectly clear definition. So he's just saying there, logic is an amazing system. It's perfect. All we have to do is follow it concisely. Where have I heard this? This is what the anarchists say. They just say, we just have to be logical. So we don't have to check with reality, just be logical and clear. In the first preface he said clearness was one of his things. Okay, well, he's being quite clear here. Which it encounters in the human mind. The early success of logic must be attributed exclusively to the narrowness of its field. It was extremely successful because it dealt with extremely little, in which abstraction may, or rather must be, made of all the objects of cognition with their characteristic distinctions, and in which the understandings has understanding has only to deal with itself and with its own forms. Okay, we don't know what he means by forms there. Just deep things inside your mind that he doesn't want to think about or define or concretize. So, the early success of all logic must be attributed exclusively to the narrowness of its field, in which abstraction may or rather must be made of all objects of cognition with their characteristic distinctions, and in which the understanding has only to deal with itself and with its forms. So, logic makes abstractions of everything, and it makes it easier to deal with. Now, I'll just remind you, logic is distilled from mathematics. So, and mathematics also makes abstractions out of everything. You can measure concretes and do math about a concrete, but math itself is just abstractions. But the abstractions aren't true unless they apply to reality. That's mathematics, right? Throwing a ball, a rocket ship flying, whatever. He wants to do that with philosophy. He wants to be like that. He wants to take logic and do with philosophy what is done in the sciences. And he wants to do this, right here he's saying he wants to do this through logic, because logic makes an abstraction of everything in order to deal with it, in which abstraction must be made of all objects of cognition. So it makes abstraction of all objects of cognition. So he's just going to be making an abstraction of all objects of cognition, just like logic does. So don't worry, he's just being logical. Okay? It is obviously a much more difficult task for reason to strike into the sure path of science, where it has to deal not simply with itself, but with objects external to itself. When does reason only deal with itself, right? Ooh, it's dealing with things external to itself. Reason cannot deal with itself. Reason doesn't exist. Reason is what is our name for things organized correctly in reality. Okay. Hence, logic is properly only a propedeutic, P-R-P-A-E-D-E-U-T-I-C, forms, as it were, the vestibule of the science. Logic is properly only a vestibule of the sciences. And while it is necessary to enable us to form a correct judgment with regard to the various branches of knowledge, still the acquisition of real, substantive knowledge is to be sought only in the sciences properly so called. That is, in the objective sciences. Okay. Hence, logic is properly only a vestibule of the sciences. And while it is necessary to enable us to form a correct judgment with regard to various branches of knowledge, still the acquisition of real substantive knowledge is to be sought only in the sciences properly so called, that is, in the objective sciences. So he starts out that sentence by saying, hence, logic is properly only a vestibule of the sciences, a pedimeutic. Okay, and he ends it by talking about seeking substantive knowledge in the objective sciences. Okay? It seems to me he switches the subject of his sentence there, and unless he's carrying it over very clearly from the previous sentence, which I did not catch, it seemed, and again this could be a problem with the translator, but I see him starting the sentence talking about, hence logic is properly only a vestibule of the science. And while it is necessary to enable us to form a correct judgment with regard to the various branches of knowledge, so logic is necessary for that, still the acquisition of real substantive knowledge is sought only in the sciences properly so called, that is, in the objective sciences. Therefore, logic won't give us substantive knowledge. Is that what he's saying? Logic is necessary, but it won't give us substantive knowledge. We have to get that from the objective sciences. Okay? Now, it doesn't seem that that squares with what he wants to do, so I'm just wondering if I got it correct there. All right, now these sciences, because it seems to me that what he wants to do is say that he can get substantive knowledge through logic alone. But he says it's properly only a vestibule of the sciences, so he's belittling it a little bit there. Would it surprise you if Kant both belittled logic and said he needed it in a sentence? Because that's what he seems to do. It says it's properly only the vestibule of the sciences, while it is necessary for us to use it in these ways. Yet we have to get substantive knowledge only through the objective sciences, not through logic. But the use of logic, though, surely. Okay, continuing, I'm sorry. When he's a mess like that, I don't want to let him off the hook. I wonder if something's going on. Okay, now these sciences, if they can be termed rational at all, must contain elements of a priori cognition. All right. We'll have to take your word for it, because there actually isn't such a thing as a priori cognition. But these sciences from which we're going to get substantive knowledge, he says in the previous sentence, these sciences, if they can be termed rational at all, must contain elements of a priori cognition. So, do you call it rational? Well, then it's got a priori cognition in it. Simple as that. And not true. And this cognition may stand in a twofold relation to its object. So, two different ways, or there's two different aspects to the one way, a twofold relationship. Either it may have to determine the conception of the object, which must be both supplied extraneously, or it may have to establish its reality. So it gets the object somewhere and has to establish its reality. It gets conception of the object. Okay. The former is theoretical, the latter is practical, rational cognition. In both, the pure or a priori element must be treated first and must carefully distinguish from that which is supplied from other sources. Any other method can only lead to irredeemable confusion. So beware. You'll be confused if you don't understand the foregoing. And excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, but we're going to unpack it. All right? Starting at the beginning of that paragraph, because he says that if we can't grasp it, we will be led to irredeemable confusion. Okay? Now, I don't trust him. So, he's doing something crafty in this paragraph. Let us try it again. These sciences, if they can be termed rational at all, so any science that you want to call rational, must contain elements of a priori cognition. Now, that's an assertion. And this cognition may stand in a certain way. So he's got just an assertion there. So he's just making an assertion there. So his first thing in this paragraph is to assert that all things that you want to call rational have a priori cognition before the senses. Okay? That's an assertion. Okay. Now we are in the introduction, but we are listening to Kant. We're reading Kant. Okay. Either it may have, now this is the two aspects. Either it may have to determine the conception of the object, which must be supplied extraneous, or it may have to establish its reality. So, what's the difference between determining the conception of an object, to determine the conception of an object? What does that mean? To determine the conception of an object, let's just call it, because you determined it, so let's just say you have determined it, and so now you've conceived the object. So let's just call that a concept of an object. Okay. It may be to determine the concept, which must be supplied extraneously, so we'll take that from the senses, or it may have to establish its reality. Well, in that case, where would it get it? Okay, the sciences, or a priori in this cognition, these sciences, if they can be termed rational at all, must contain elements of a priori cognition. This cognition, okay, so a priori cognition in the sciences is of one of two ways. A priori cognition in the sciences either determines the conception of an object or establishes the reality of an object. So it determines the conception of an object or establishes its reality. So I guess that's the idea of it in your mind or the fact of it in concrete. Okay. So now we know what he says. Let's start that paragraph over. Now these sciences, if they can be termed rational at all, so all rational sciences must contain elements of a priori cognition. And this cognition may stand in a twofold relation to its object. Either it may have to determine the conception of the object, or it may have to establish its reality. Okay, the former is theoretical, the latter is practical, rational cognition. Okay, so rationality deals with concrete reality. Theoretical deals with abstract. Okay, in both, the pure or the a priori element must be treated first. Now he just said at the beginning there is an a priori element, and now he says it has to be treated first and must be carefully distinguished from that which is supplied from the other sources. So the a priori element is very important, and it is definitely there, he says. Any other method can only lead to irredeemable confusion. So beware, you've got to understand this a priori business, whatever it means. Right? And he hasn't said here, this is just the preface. Alright, there he's just that whole paragraph is a little red flag. This a priori business is extremely important. You need to understand it, or you're going to be left out of the cool group, right? There's the commoners, and then we're the cool group. Alright. Mathematics, and going on to the next paragraph, mathematics and physics are the two theoretical sciences which have to determine their objects a priori. Mathematics and physics are the two theoretical sciences which, how would they determine their objects a priori? They have to determine their objects without using sense perception. Physics? Really? Okay. The former is purely a priori. Oh, mathematics. We can do it purely without sense perception. And the latter is partially so, but is also dependent on other sources of cognition. What? Experiments? That's really the only thing he could mean, right? Physical sciences require experiments. That's really the only thing he could mean. Okay. In the earliest time, so he's giving lip service to physical reality and to evidence of the senses. Okay. In the earliest times of which history affords us any record, mathematics has already entered on the sure course of science among that wonderful nation, the Greeks. Still, it is not to be supposed that it was as easy for this science to strike into, or rather to construct for itself, that royal road, as it was for logic, in which reason has only to deal with itself. On the contrary, I believe that it must have remained long, chiefly among the Egyptians, in the stage of blind groping after its true aims and destination, and that it was revolutionized by the happy idea of one man who struck out and determined for all time the path of which this science must follow, and which admits of an indefinite advancement. The history of this intellectual revolution, much more important in its results than the discovery of the passage round the celebrated Cape of Good Hope, and of its author, has not been preserved. But Diogenes Laertius, in naming the supposed discoverer of some of the simplest elements of geometrical demonstration, elements which, according to the ordinary opinion, do not even require to be proved, makes it apparent that the change introduced by the first indication of this new path must have seemed of the utmost importance to the mathematicians of that age, and it has thus been secured against the chance of oblivion. Alright, so some mathematical thing happened back in the ancient world that was very important, and we know about it today, even though we don't know the individual. A new light must have flashed on in the mind of the first man, Thales, or whatever may have been his name, who demonstrated the properties of the isosceles triangle. For he found that it was not sufficient to meditate on the figure, as it lay before his eyes, or the conception of it, as it existed in his mind, and thus endeavor to get at the knowledge of its properties, but that it was necessary to produce these properties, as it were, by a positive a priori construction. What is an a priori construction? And that, in order to arrive with certainty at a priori cognition, he must not attribute to the object any other properties than those which necessarily follow from that which he had himself, in accordance with his conception, placed in the object. Wow, according to his conception, what does it mean, placed in the object? Wow, okay. Now I'm reaching burnout stage, so I'm going to digest that paragraph and start fresh on the next video with a digestion of that paragraph. So here's my challenge to you, ladies and gentlemen. Break that paragraph we just went through, starting within the earliest times of which history affords us any record. Break that down into the smallest number of sentences you can. See how well you can do compared to what I'll come up with at the beginning of the next video, Immanuel Kant series. Thank you for joining us, MrCropper. Patreonize me. Thank you.